Um, so be a good co-host. so, so everything that I said up to now is totally forgotten in terms of history. I hope we'll get over that trauma. But so a Baal Tshuva in real life, a Baal Tshuva is usually someone who's never been religious. And so even though so the sense that individual is returning not to his early roots, but maybe returning, to an ancestor in his or her family who was traditional, or returning to the ancestral roots of our people in a sense. But so the idea of return is not best. It doesn't mean that you're going back to what you were doing 6 months ago or 6 years ago. So the contrast between COVID is when we talk about, there's an entire section, which I'm kind of maybe alluding to on Rosh Hashanah. There's an entire section in this past week's New York Times, the style section, totally devoted to what are we going to be returning to? What's the world going to look like when this is over? No one knows. Nobody knows, obviously. But all the speculation as to what are things going to be like, what will revert to the way it was 6 months ago, and what won't. What won't? I mean, we're if you're a political junkie, I mean, I was a political junkie last week, much less so this week, but I was watching the Democratic Convention every night, the 2 hours every night. And the comments, of course, were, even though it was all virtual, there were things that people really liked and imagined that will be retained, even when a full convention with 30,000 people will again be possible, God willing, in the coming year or two. So things that will change. It won't go revert to exactly the way it was 4 years ago. There will be changes that will, and that will happen also in synagogue. That will happen also in synagogue. We have put in really good live streaming equipment. We're tweaking it, and it's not totally perfect yet, but we're getting there. And I don't imagine that once COVID is over and there's a vaccine, et cetera, that we're going to take down the cameras. I mean, we're now, because even before we entered these last 6 months in the BC period, the before COVID period of history, we talked about the number of people that want to be part of shul, but that are unable to come for physical reasons. Usually, they're just not able to come to shul, but they would love to be part of our service. So we now have that technology to make that possible. So clearly, even though we haven't defined it yet fully, clearly we are not going to be reverting once, God willing, soon this pandemic has receded. We're not going to be reverting exactly to the way it was. There'll be some changes that will aggravate us because obviously the whole aspect of hygiene will affect how we conduct things. I don't know when we will restore a Torah procession with people kissing the Torah. Perhaps never. I don't know. So certain things that we won't be happy about will change, but certain things that will enhance the way we observe will change. So the idea being that contrast that to the Chuva that our tradition speaks of during the month of Elul and between Rosh Hashanah and from Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur, which implies returning to something that's pretty clearly defined, returning to a pristine form of Jewish practice that has been someone maybe either neglected or person was not educated in that tradition, but you're returning to something that exists and can be clearly documented and found in books. That's very clear. We know pretty well exactly what that is when you're returning in Judaism. We know, or we can access through the codes and through the Talmud and through the Mishnah and through Torah, we can access what that actually looks like pretty well 100%. Very different from the return that we will speak of when we go back in history to a time of normalcy. That also, I want to talk a bit about history. It's in my mind because I today had the funeral for an elderly gentleman who was a survivor and went through the worst of the Holocaust, whose wife passed away just a year ago, also going through the worst of the Holocaust. They met in DP camp. The rest became history. Now, what I found with the two of them of blessed memory and many others that I've confronted in that circumstance and families that I've confronted, there was no return. In other words, there was no possibility of return to where they came from. They weren't able to return to their shtetl in Poland, didn't exist anymore. They couldn't return. Everything that they had known pretty well was destroyed. So a lot of people at that point made it to Israel. And that was the case of the gentleman today and his late wife, made it to Israel, lived 15 years in this case, which is longer than some did, because look, it was really difficult. They suffered so much and lost so much, and just had the opportunity to find an easier life in Canada, so came here at a certain point. But this again, there was never going to be a return to the way it was. They weren't going to be returning to their shtetl, and that was almost an impossibility for all those who survived. Even those who ended up staying in other places, still their lives changed dramatically. So there was no possibility of return again. But in many cases, built very good lives and very wonderful lives, whether it was in Israel, whether in Canada, wherever it was, and really had a lot to be proud of in the greater scheme of things. So the concept of return, again, in life is much more complicated than the concept of Chuva in Judaism, again, because you know exactly what you're going back to. And circumstance doesn't really affect it, except in the fact that halacha modifies on the time in terms of we somehow adjust to technology, and even in orthodoxy. I'm not talking about egalitarianism in this case. I'm not talking about liberalizations, but even in terms of traditional halacha, we go back to you can go. Certain things will modify. Halacha allows the use of an electric razor, for example. In ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic communities, that's not done. But there was a permitted way of shaving that you see many Orthodox rabbis, certainly 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, most modern Orthodox rabbis were clean shaven, as I am when I'm not lazy and when I shave. But there are, that was that was an acceptance of modern technology that didn't exist in the time of the Mishnah or Talmud, or the codes in the early Middle Ages. That didn't exist. So you can talk, was it permitted to use an electric razor would be an absurdity until the 20th century. So you see 20th century affecting halacha. I'll tell you a funny story. He passed away recently. And I really liked him. I had very nice interactions with him, and I miss him. The late Rabbi Hoshander, who was Rabbi of Shar Shemaim for many years. I'm sure many of you knew him, or certainly confronted him, saw him in the community. And when I came to Toronto 40 years ago, he was clean shaven. Toward in the latter part of his life, he had a pretty substantial beard. So one of his Orthodox colleagues was visiting in town, and I happened to meet him. And he said to me, "When did Henry become from?" Which he didn't really mean it that way, it didn't mean it as an insult, but because he remembered him as clean shaven. So I'm suggesting that shows that halacha, even though we're returning to something that is very well established, there's a whole aspect of Jewish law and practice that has modified with time in terms of technology, and that technology is studied and analyzed in terms of whether or not that can be part of Jewish tradition. There's an institute in Israel called the Institute of Science and Halacha, which has created technologies that are, and from strict Orthodox point of view, technologies that allow equipment to be used on Shabbat that you would not expect to be allowed. For example, a call button for a patient to be able to call a nurse if a patient is in distress. You would think that a buzzer couldn't be pressed by a religious patient on a Shabbat in a religious hospital. This Institute of Science and Halacha created such a mechanism that enables that to be used in many, many other functions where modernity became part of the traditional picture. So even though I'm saying Teshuvah means returning to something that did pre-exist, and it's certainly well established in the codes and in Jewish law, even that has known modification, but through very careful and deep analysis. There's some great journals, and I'll be happy to give copies as I try to downscale my library. I have like 25 years of certain journals or 30 years of certain journals that deal with science and halacha and technology and how you determine whether some modern technology can become part of practice. So Chuva is, if I do anything in this hour, it's going to be to show you that nothing is simple, including Chuva, even though I'm saying that we know what we're going back to as opposed to pre-COVID. We don't know what the world will look like then. We didn't know the whole world changed after the Shoah, and people there was no possibility of a return to what was before. Everything, in a sense, was new. In terms of Jewish tradition, you return to something, but even that is something that's not static. So any tshuva, any return, a bal tshuva today, someone who is adopting Jewish practice for the first time, is not going to be living an identical form of Judaism to what a Zayda did in the old country, um, because there are things that the grandson can do that the Zayda couldn't do because of the development of technology and science, etc., that basically amplified our understanding of what was possible. So there is a certain aspect of Jewish practice that is very responsive to the world, and there is there are things that basically will be the same as they were for the last several thousand, a couple of thousand years plus. One example that I love to give are things that remain static and will never really adopt to technology is the Sefer Torah. We do not, how we create a Sefer Torah has not changed in 2,000 years. It's exactly the same equipment, the same pen, the same ink, the same cloth, the same parchment, hasn't changed at all. That's one example of something that will never change. Printed books, of course, that's changing. It's all available now on, I have I have more Judaica on this than most libraries would have, and we all can have that because technology enables us to take almost every single printed book in Jewish life and have it, on a device, and be able. It's incredible what access we have to traditional sources. So books, printed books, absolutely, technology has changed the world for us. But the Sefer Torah, the Megillah we read on Purim, although that's more flexible in terms of how you're allowed to read them. How you can sort of have some design in the Megillah. There's more flexibility than in a Sefer Torah. But the Sefer Torah that we read on Shabbat and on Mondays and Thursdays and Shabbat Mincha, that has not changed at all. And that's one of the most powerful examples of things that will always remain the same. Much will change through technology, but I think one of the richnesses of our tradition is that there are there's a responsiveness to what happens in the world today, but that it doesn't mean that it's not based on some classical form. The idea of allowing an electric razor to be used, and the groups, by the way, that oppose that are those that feel that nothing can change, that they basically are there's nothing in modernity that can adjust the way we do things. Has to be the same way that was done 10 generations ago. That's why Hasidic groups do not change their clothing from what their founding Rebbe wore 2 centuries ago or 3 centuries ago. And he didn't use an electric razor. They're not going to use it. And they will never shave. For that is one example. So again, the idea of tshuva is something that it's in a sense very dynamic. Even in tradition, we're returning to a code that we adjust to, and if there are things that change, it has to be based on a precedent that can be directly connected to it, as opposed to just inventing something new that had no basis in the past that would contradict what we used to do. So let's look at some text. What I should do first is just because I've really, I may have said some things that were rather obscure and complicated. I'll pause for a couple of minutes if there are any questions that you may have at this point. If you want to just wave a hand, I will take a breath and no, okay. So that's how that could be good or bad when there are no questions. It'd either be that everyone is a schlifferdick at this point, or I've been so incredibly, brilliant in my explanations that there's nothing that, of course, I prefer the latter. But so let's look at. I want to just share a screen with you for a moment or two to look at a couple of texts on classical views of tshuva and try to see how that pertains to us and to life today. So I'm going to do a screen share. Okay, here we go. Okay, these are various sources that deal with basically tshuva as repentance. And I apologize that the English, these are rather it's not a contemporary English, but I think we'll get through it. So at beginning at the top at 696, which is the second source on the left, the teaching of the Mishnaic sage Reish Lakish is that penitence, in this case Chuva, is great indeed. Why? Because it reduces intentional transgressions to inadvertent acts. So in a sense, Chuva, as being understood here, is something that is not about Chuva, somebody who's returning from total non-observance to becoming observant, but somebody who considers him or herself to be part of the community that observes mitzvot, that is observant. So Chuva, it says here, is good because basically on a verse in Hosea, the prophet, which says, Kashalta b'avonecha, that you have stumbled in your iniquity, that if you stumble, it's considered to be accidental. You didn't mean to do it. Whereas iniquity, avera, or avon as the word is in the prophet, that's something that's considered to be intentional. Like you did it, that was deliberate, it wasn't accidental. But what's happening in terms of tshuva, the power of it, according to the Reish Lakish, is that it basically takes what was deliberate or intentional and considers it as if it were accidental, which means that will mean again that you're going to get off with a much lighter sentence, as it were. So it's like when you downgrade because first degree murder versus second degree murder or homicide or manslaughter. I mean, you go to the various levels. I mean, it lessens the severity of the action. So that's the idea. Tshuva has the power when we return voluntarily, of not worrying about whether or not you did it deliberately. You knew you were violating the mitzvah. You knew you shouldn't have been cutting your lawn on Shabbos. You knew that stop at McDonald's where you went beyond what you should is not something that you knew you shouldn't be doing that, but you did it anyhow. So that was deliberate. But if you do tshuva, it's considered to have been accidental. You didn't know. Oh, I remember when I was in New York as a student, it's a long time ago. There was a whole scandal because the Heinz company had mislabeled an entire production line of vegetarian baked beans. They had put those labels on pork and beans. So you had all of these, it had an OU on it. So it was kosher certified. The baked beans that were in reality was pork and beans. So that's obviously an accidental violation that was not deliberate. So, you're not going to really, you don't have tshuva demands won't be too significant. But, I just had this vision of going all through the boroughs of Manhattan, people saying, Sadie, was ist das in Deutschland? So it just tasted different, that Shabbos, and hopefully they didn't like it too much. But, that's the idea of basically deliberate, and that's one of the powers of tshuva. So let me just look at a couple other things with you. Just going to do some selections here. Okay, let's not do this. Let's so interesting concept of repentance when you're returning, doing tshuva, and you're actually seeking forgiveness. If you look at 699, top of the right hand side, Rava says that one who refrains from retaliation, meaning seeking revenge, all of his sins will be pardoned, because based on a verse in the prophet Micha, which says Nosei avon over al pesha, with basically meaning that God forgives sins and forgives our wrongdoing. That's the whole purpose of Yom Kippur. We're asking forgiveness for what we've done as part of the tshuva process. We're asking to be forgiven for our sins, and we'll talk about what sins we're talking about in a moment. That basically suggests God is the model for us. So who we read in the Talmud and Tractate Rosh Hashanah, does God pardon? The person himself who forgives transgressions of others. So in other words, if you want God to forgive you for something you've done wrong, somebody comes to you and asks for forgiveness for something a way they wronged you. If you forgive that person, then God will forgive you. In other words, you have to emulate God's compassion in the sense of being lenient and forgiving us for sins, especially at this time of year, if we're sincere in our act of penitence. So, but the idea where you're putting the onus on us that our behavior has to be compassionate if we want to be benefiting from God's compassion. So, one of the, I mentioned, the concept of Baal Tshuva, of a person who is a penitent, someone who's returning to from non-observance to a fully observant life. That is, what we find in that world, and even there are sources in this, in our tradition that reflect this. That there's one statement that says you can't stand in the same place as a Baal Tshuva. You can't. And so one view was that because the Baal Tshuva is so special, the person who's repented and has returned to tradition is such a special individual that you can't stand in his place because he's so superior to you. But the other view says you can't stand because he is so obnoxious, you don't want to be near him. So there's the idea that you can't be, if you're returning, if you're trying to seek forgiveness, you have to be menschlich. You have to be nice, not acting as if you know more than everybody else. Occasionally I've confronted somebody who's been observant for 5 minutes and they're acting like, they're going to teach me Torah. And, so they're not really yet ready. You need a certain amount of modesty, and that will come up in some of the sources. I don't know if we'll look at them tonight, but that will come up in some of the sources that talk about what repentance is supposed to be all about. Now, so I want to just take a peek at another source. I want to take a peek at Maimonides, at the Rambam. Okay, here, who is basically, this is the classic source of that deals with Chuva, that deals with return. And his Hilchot Chuva are, that's really the primary source to go to if you want to study what does Jewish law say about return, but the repentance kind of returning to an authentic form of Jewish life. And again, I remember there are two models, that of a Baal Tshuva, of Chuva. One is that it's a person who's still within the system, but has screwed up a bit, made mistakes, not been as careful as he or she should be, but is still pretty well living within the confines, or within the realm of Jewish life, but making mistakes. And that, by the way, usually includes everybody. I'm just going to stop the screen share for a second so I want to see you. 1 second. Okay, stop share. One of the one of the aspects of tshuva, of return, is that you want to be you want to be part of the you want to be part of the community, and you're also you're also, in a sense, you've made mistakes, you've done things wrong, you haven't, but you're not in a non-observant environment. You're not living a life like a total Gentile. You're not living a life that's completely removed from the Jewish world. You're living a life that would be within the parameters of Jewish people. You're still, you're going to shul period, you're doing stuff, but there are things you're not doing that you should be doing, or things that you used to do you stop doing, things that you're not careful about. So that's a lot about what our tradition talks about. So that's, in a sense, mild tshuva, when you're kind of just sharpening your act. That's the reason why, by the way, why everybody has to do tshuva. You'd think if somebody is frum, if somebody is totally observant, and really, why would they have to daven on Yom Kippur? Why would they have to fast, in atonement? Why do they shouldn't need to do tshuva, because they're already there. What are they returning to? They're already, why do they need to do tshuva? The point is that there's nobody who's a tzaddik v'lo yechta. There's no person who is so righteous that he or she will never sin. We all make mistakes. We all miss certain things, whether it's deliberate or accidental. Everybody has to do tshuva. There is no, it's assumed by our tradition, there is no possibility that somebody in a year has done nothing wrong. Even the best person will still inadvertently. Sometimes it won't be inadvertent. Sometimes you just do something. I mean, by the way, a lot of mitzvot are moral or ethical. So sometimes it just means you weren't nice to somebody. That's also an avera. It doesn't mean only if you eat treif, that's an avera, or if you cut down a tree on Shabbos. I mean, there are moral actions too, and some people who are very good on the ritual are not so good on the moral. We all make mistakes. Every human being, again, Kohelet says there is no person who lives who is such a tzaddik that he never sins. That doesn't exist in human history. It doesn't there. So everyone has to do tshuva of some, whether there are a few things, whether it's a small amount, or whether it's the totality of one's being. If one is completely off the derech, as they say in the frum world, if you're completely off the path, or if you are on the path but you kind of have wandered away a little bit. So everyone has to do tshuva. There is considered to be no possibility that a person is exempt. By the way, one of the classic jokes that we often repeat, that especially in our shul, but in almost every shul, when we daven Ma'ariv at the end of Yom Kippur, it's usually daven pretty quickly. Like we race through it for obvious reasons. Fasting for 25 hours, or if you have to come to shul 3 hours early, less of a problem this year. But if you have to come to shul 3 hours early, and you see you've been fasting possibly for 28, 29 hours, you're hungry, you're thirsty. So once the shofar is sounded to end the fast, and then Ma'ariv, no one is going to want a cantorial concert for that Ma'ariv. Nobody is going to want a half an hour Ma'ariv, with songs, with a choir. Nobody wants that. You want Ma'ariv to be done in 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So the sources deal with that. The sources deal with that and say that why in that Amidah, in the Amidah of Ma'ariv at the end of Yom Kippur, we say, Slach lanu avinu ki chatanu, forgive us, O God, for we have sinned. So the question is, we just spent 25 hours being forgiven for our sins. So in the time between the shofar and Ma'ariv, it's 1 millisecond. What sin could we have done in that tiny, tiny space of time? So the answer is the sin is we daven Ma'ariv so quickly. So that's so there's always going to be some. So that reason you say, forgive us, God, because even though we just, spent this whole 25 hours in this whole period of time in the month of Elul, the 10 days of penitence, we spent all this time seeking, and so now aren't we forgiven? And then we have to say, forgive us. So so we have to find a reason why we say it now. The reason why we say it actually is because it's in the Amidah. So we don't change the text of the Amidah because it happens to be right after Yom Kippur. But I love that explanation. So let's go back to Rambam for a few minutes. Excuse me. Let's go to Rambam. We haven't done him yet. Let me share again. Excuse me. So this, by the way, I want to give you a commercial. For something, I have no financial interest in this, but it's something that is amazing on the web called Safaria, where almost every significant Jewish text is accessible. It's totally free, and you can you can even, for a teacher, like I'm doing now, preparing study sheets. That's in front of you, where you can have Hebrew, the original Hebrew, with an English translation, and you can prepare this instantly. All of the Talmud, most significant rabbinic texts. So it's an amazing production. It actually was funded by the Koshitsky family, but it's worldwide. It has taken over this is something that is amazing. So in the beginning of chapter 2 of his Maimonides' laws of Chuva, Ilchot Chuva, his laws of return, repentance. So he asked the question in the Hebrew, Ezu hi Chuva Gemor, what is perfect, complete repentance? And he gives this great example. I don't know if you followed the story of Jerry Falwell Jr. I'm not going to go into it now, but he should learn this text, even though I don't think he studies Rambam too often. So it basically, how do you know if, and this is such a brilliant answer. It's a little bit off, like a little bit graphic. I mean, so people might get a little bit offended by this, but it's Rambam is not pulling any punches here. So he says, Zeh shabali ado devarshas avarlo. Somebody, you did an avera, and he's giving the example is you had an illicit relationship with a woman, and so it's like pretty interesting example. So, and he says, how do you know if you've done, and you do tshuva, slachlan, if God forgive me for this terrible thing I did, forgive me, it was awful what I did. So how do you know if he's done tshuva, if his tshuva is really complete, if he's really returned to the authenticity of a religious observance? So Maimonides says, he who once more had the power to repeat, if he was able to do it again, if he had the opportunity to do again what he did with that woman, but abstained from doing it, not because of tshuva, not because of and he didn't do it. Sorry, he did it because he'd done tshuva, not because he was afraid he was going to be caught or that he didn't have the physical capability of doing it again. So he basically, and he gives you he goes into detail here about what the situation is. He knew a woman sinfully, and after a process of time, he met her again privately. He had the opportunity. He still was attracted to her, and he still was able to do the deed. And everything was, all the circumstances were as they were in the first case. If he abstained from doing it, if he walked away, that's tshuva gemura, that's complete tshuva. In other words, you have to, it's not a theoretical thing, but if you had the opportunity to do something, like let's say you're, there's something that you shouldn't be doing, and look, let's say you're trying to quit smoking, and you're telling you're quitting smoking and everything else, but you have the opportunity, you're in private, no one's around, and you have a cigarette sitting there, and you walk away from it. That's but the idea here, this is a better example because it deals with so many different categories. It talks about how at some point you're not able to do that anymore. You get older, it's not always opportune. Then it's not really, you don't know if the tshuva is complete because you weren't tested. You weren't in the same circumstance. You couldn't repeat the misdeed. So it's not really, not a case of really knowing. But he goes on to be lenient at the end of this and said that even if somebody is not able, like does tshuva for this action toward the end of his life, when he's no longer capable of doing it, he couldn't repeat the sin. Even at that point, he'll be forgiven. Even as if but ultimately, if you want to consider something to be tshuva gemura, complete total return, you have to be able to avoid the temptation, avoid should the opportunity arise in a very similar circle. I think it's a brilliant kind of example that one can what's really relatable. And we see that exemplified so often in our world, tragically, that particular example. So it's really insightful that 900 years ago, that's the illustration that the Rambam took. By the way, it's interesting that Maimonides gives that example because he was really, let's put it this way, the Rambam was not somebody you'd want to invite to parties. He wasn't the sociable type. He said that all these things we have to do, like eating and drinking and having sex and anything in that category that satisfied a sensual need, was something that we had to suffer through as mortals. If we were divine, you're exempt from that. Angels don't have to eat or drink or have sex. You don't have to do any of that stuff. But humans, tragically, according to Rambam, have to do that. So that's part of our baggage as human beings. So ideally, and they talk about in the world to come, his vision of the Olam Haba was that humans who were in the Olam Haba would not have to do those things. You could spend all your day in Nehanin Miziva Shechina by deriving benefit from the rays of the Holy One, like just dealing with spirituality, learning Gemara, doing all these wonderful things, not having to do with anything sensual. That to him was the ideal. I'm not sure most of us would sign up for that world necessarily. But again, the Rambam did not get a lot of party invitations because he wasn't Mr. Excitement when it came to social things. He felt, you had to do what you have to do. But that, by the way, was not a normative Jewish view necessarily. That was really particular to the Rambam. Maybe the influence of Aristotelian philosophy, the stuff that influenced him in the world. that, was not necessarily similar to what you'd see in the Talmud. There were, the sages were fine with sensuality. You can enjoy life. It was fine. Go ahead, have a good time, as long as you observe the mitzvot. Go ahead and you can enjoy sensual. It's okay to enjoy. But Maimonides was not really into that. So the fact that he gives that example is really interesting, because it's really far from his persona. As he's probably saying, I can't imagine somebody who's going to do such a thing, because it's bad enough you have to do it with your wife, to do it with another person. I'm really have to do this for her. Okay, but it was interesting that he gives that example. So the other now a lovely example, which is which is Talmudic as well. A lot of what Maimonides in his Mishnah Torah, from which this is taken, most of what he's taking is coming from the Talmud. It's coming from, but he doesn't footnote it. So you have to get an annotated version of the Mishnah Torah to know where this appears in the Gemara. But he's taking Talmudic law and he's basically reordering it in a much more understandable sequence. That's why this was very controversial in the 13th century, because it was felt that he was shown chutzpah by, in a sense, saying that you don't really need the Talmud anymore. You get all of Jewish law here. I've made it much more accessible, and he did. Mishnah Torah is it's crystal clear. It's in beautiful Hebrew, very easy to understand. And he's a very good explainer, as we say in Hebrew, Bal Masbir. He really explains things very effectively and very well and very thoroughly. So in a way, he's right, but it never happened. He did not take away. People still study the Gemara, but will often, have alongside them a copy of the Mishnah Torah, or as they call it, the Rambam. Even though, because a lot of times in traditional circles, you refer to a book by the name of the author. So when someone says, they don't say, did you check the Mishnah Torah? They say, did you look at the Rambam? And one of my teachers used to say, when the Rambam wrote the Rambam, because the book was known by his name, so we always thought that was funny, but to him it wasn't funny. That's what you talked about. The book was called the Rambam because they used the name of the author to indicate the name of the book. So when the Rambam wrote the Rambam was one of my favorite quotations from my rabbinical school years. So let's look at one other source here in the Rambam, when the Rambam wrote the Rambam. Halacha number Gimel 3 in chapter 2. And again, this is very clearly appearing in the Talmud as well. Kol hamitvadeh bidvarim v'lo gamar belibo la'azov. Now, this is something that I think affects us a lot in life. If you vow verbally to, basically to abstain from certain things, that you confess, verbally, v'lo gamar belibo la'azov, but you didn't really, it's not really in your heart. You're talking the talk, but you're not walking the walk. So he gives a great example of what that's all about. He says, Harei zeh domeh letovel v'sheretz biyado. It's as if somebody is going into the mikveh holding on to the reptile. In other words, what does that mean? A reptile makes you impure. If you touch a reptile, which I don't think any of us are planning to do this week, but if you happen to be maybe I shouldn't assume that. Maybe some of you have reptiles at home. But if somehow you touch a reptile, that is mitameh, it makes you impure. So you got to make a trip to the mikveh. But he says, if you go to the mikveh and you're holding onto the reptile and you jump into the mikveh with the reptile in your hand, you're still holding onto the impurity. So unless you get rid of the impurity, the mikveh doesn't do anything. It's of no value. It says, She'ein hatvila mo'elet lo ad sheyashlich hasheretz. Until you throw away the reptile, or he translates here as the impure, creepy thing, until you cast it away, don't bother going to the mikveh. It's a waste of your time. It doesn't do it. So it basically becomes it basically becomes it becomes a rather useless exercise when you it becomes if you haven't really repented. In other words, if you just said you went through the motions, that's a problem. In the sense where, let's say we're talking about Yom Kippur, and we're doing in shul all day. Won't be all day this year, but we're davening. We're going through a lot of prayer, and doing the Al-Khair 11 times. We're going through this confessional 11 times from the evening, from Mincha, Erev Yom Kippur, until through Ne'ilah. And if you're doing at some point, but if you're just going through the motions, but you're not really thinking, it's not, and that, by the way, is very possible. I would admit that if we have, let's say, in a good year, we have 1,000 people in shul, and 1,500 or 1,600 if we take or 1,800 if we take our total number in different minyanim, and I would say that a certain percentage of people who will be saying the words, but not really. It's not reflective of what they're really going to do. In other words, it's going through motions without actually having effect. That's that's the way the world functions, unfortunately. But my mom is saying, that's not good enough. In other words, you have to, you got to do both. In other words, real. If you want to really do it, it has to be real. I mean, it has to. Don't say the words if it's not going to really be something that you take seriously. If it's not going to be something that really penetrates your your being and your action and your behavior, then it's kind of meaningless. Like when I basically, when I talk to someone who, about conversion to Judaism, for example, that's a conversation that I probably have a few times a month. That's something that we get involved in a lot as rabbis. The idea, there has to be an element of sincerity. It doesn't mean necessarily that we're assuming that the potential convert is going to do every single mitzvah that exists on the planet. Most Jews don't, even people in religious communities don't always do that. But that you got to be sincere that you really want to do as much as you can and learn as much as you can, take on as much as you can, and keep moving up the ladder of practice. So that part of, you need the sincerity, not to just get a document to satisfy, a need that you want, but without it being sincere. When it doesn't have to be, look, if you take a citizenship test, I mean, clearly the desire is that you're really not just doing it because you want to, live us in a certain place for practical personal reasons, but it means something to you, that you really feel a sense of attachment to the country that you want to become your own, and it's really coming from the heart. You're not just doing it to get the piece of paper, but it's something that you are that is really sincere. So any kind of, and a tshuva in a sense is a reaffirmation of the constitution of Jewish life, as it were, and really trying to be as close as possible to the traditions and practices that have kept us in history so long, and that have kept us together as a people, as a nation, and that have meant so much to those who came before us, and really explain why we're still here today into the third millennium of our history, which everyone could say that should not have happened. All of the ancient peoples who were around when we at our beginning, and the people that they're gone. I mean, they don't have. They're just not. They didn't. That at a point in history they didn't survive. We did somehow, and we've outlived a lot of our adversaries. But it's not been an easy path. But there was that kind of sense that what we were committing ourselves to, we really felt it in the heart. It wasn't just mouthing something that had no meaning for us, because that won't last necessarily. Even though there's something to be said about the mouthing, because if it's the act of prayer, that's actually a mitzvah. But at some point, you want the words to penetrate. You want the values that our tradition represents to be represented in who you are. One of the if I were to say, like, I know Rabbi Galinkin, when he would be coming for years, and this is the first year in 37 years that he's not going to be here. Very sadly, it's one of the tragedies of COVID. But his thing, as those of you who attended his service, was every year in Kol Nidre, he took one mitzvah, and he was trying to get you to do that mitzvah if you haven't done it before. He would pick a mitzvah a year, which was, I think was a very nice idea. And in the sense, if I were, one of the mitzvot that I think is incumbent upon us to really look into very seriously, and that's the mitzvah of really learning Hebrew. We don't have a high rate of Hebrew literacy in our communities, and I think I think it's very powerful when you can understand the sources that make us who we are, and not have to depend upon translation totally, but there were certain books, when I was a rabbinical student, 40 years ago plus, there were certain books that classic, rabbinic texts that were very special in that they were not available in translation. In order to read them, you had to know Hebrew. For better or for worse, Art Scroll translated all of them. So there's almost nothing that you can't find out in English translation, but there is a true benefit to being able to penetrate something in its original language, because that gets, in a sense, and you feel it in your heart. I love to give the example, which has nothing to do with halacha, but the example when I studied Yiddish back at McGill in the 70s. I had some great teachers, and but it was such a I had, as a kid, I had read a lot of the Parrot stories and other classic stories in Yiddish literature in English translation. But I remember the first time reading the story Bancha Schweig, Bancha the Silent, in Yiddish, and it was a very emotional experience, actually reading it in the language in which it was written. If you know the story, and it's a really famous story, so I'm sure you've all heard it, but you know the story when Bancha at the end, is the angel says to him, and the tribunal that's judging him after his death, the head of the tribunal says to him, the chief judge, as it says, you can have whatever you want because you've been so mistreated in life that whatever you want is yours. What do you want? And he says at the time, and he says, and in English is really, really, really. But when you read it in Yiddish, taka, it's power. I mean, there's a power that is incredibly beyond, what you can read in the translation. You really feel it. And the story asks for nothing, asks for bread and butter. And so there's a whole lot, and that's another discussion as to what parrots really meant in that story. But there's in a sense, when you can penetrate the actual language, that the original language, you can penetrate our sources in Hebrew. You don't have to be a Hebrew scholar, you don't have to be a bialik, you don't have to be totally absolutely fluent, but when you know enough to be able to really feel it and have a sense of what the words mean. So that to me is a great Chuva task for people, in order to try to reconnect them in a very serious way with Jewish tradition. As an aside, I will also say that I may have set one of the records when there was a Yiddish production of Fiddler on the Roof in New York. I spoke about this in Shul a couple times. I loved it so much, I saw it 4 times. Over the 2.5 years that it played, I saw it 4 times. And each time was more powerful to me, just to see, in the Yiddish, what really resonated in Yiddish. And there were people there who weren't Jewish, but they loved it. People were sobbing. It was very moving, much more moving in Yiddish than in English. And it was going back to, there was an original Yiddish translation 50 years ago and it was more closer to the Shalom Aleichem stories than what you saw in the movie or what you saw in the English theater versions. But it was also something that it spoke in the original language, tells you something. So that to me is a great way to do a serious tshuva that may take more than a year, but to really make a commitment to really start to. I know there are people who are in this room right now who have studied Hebrew in recent years, and I know that I think Elise is here because who spent 6 months in an ulpan this past year to learn Hebrew. I know the Kansas are doing it, and other people here have, I know that Ruth spends a lot of time in Israel, so I'm sure you're learning Hebrew. But I think that that to do some serious study is something that, if you want to do an act of tshuva, that really is an amazing way of bringing you close to our tradition. That's one example. So I'm going to do a summary sentence or two, then I'll see if there are any questions that people have. The summary sentence is going to be that the Jewish concept of tshuva, of return, ostensibly is simpler than return in other aspects of life. The return to a normalcy after COVID, after the pandemic, we can't really understand what form that's going to take. There's too much unknown there. In terms of after the Shoah, even the establishment of Israel, there was such an unknown, it was hard to really, and the return to where the way things were was going to be an impossibility. In terms of religion, in terms of Judaism, in one sense, the return is very simple and straightforward because it's all there written. It's all before us what traditional Judaism is all about. And it is pretty solid and consistent, even notwithstanding the adoptions that are made to modernity where that is possible. So, but nonetheless, Chuva itself, return, is complicated because we're human, and to deal with our foibles as human beings, the mistakes that inevitably we make, it's very hard to go back to a pristine form of life, and to be sincere about it and to do it properly and to do it well. But it's the fact that we endeavor on a year-to-year basis to make that part of our vernacular, what we talk about, is something that I think says a lot about the Jewish people, that we really try to do our best and that we try to self-improve, and that we feel there is no shame to say, Chatati, that I've made a mistake, that I have done wrong. That's a sign of honesty. It's a sign of sophistication. It's a sign of brilliance. It's a sign of humanity. And again, God will only will forgive us if we forgive those who wrong us. So it also tells us that we have to face each other with a measure of compassion. So tshuva, as simple as it may be in theory, is never simple, but it's something that I think is a dynamic that keeps us alive and keeps us who we are. So I'm now going to so now I've finished. Let me see if we have questions or comments for a few moments from anybody. If anyone wants to write it in the chat, you can do that too. A lot of you I can't see because you're hidden, so I won't know if you have. But if anyone wants to, any questions, I'd be happy to answer. I saw a hand up, but then I realized it was me. So, anyone, any questions? No? Oh, Sharon has a question. Okay, okay. Please unmute yourself.
Mute. Am I unmuted?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. What happens if the sin or what a person does to you is so great, you find it hard to forgive? Say we'll go into like almost like hurting someone physically or mentally, or it's so good. Why should you not, because you don't forgive them, you might,
Okay,
why does God have to punish us for that?
No, I got the question.
And you've been a good person.
I got the question. It's a very good one. I think that we're basically speaking in general here about moderate sins, not somebody, God forbid, who murders your spouse, murders or injures you in a very severe way, or sets fire to your head. Not somebody who's done something that is very that is grotesque or terrible. We're not expected to be we're not expected to forgive murderers. We're not expected. We're talking about the day-to-day kinds of things. I would say more likely the things that you're angry at the person who insulted you, that something mean, didn't invite you to a party, hurt you in a way like that, but not somebody who did something that was devastatingly harmful to you. I think that would be, in a sense, I would believe there's a line that is crossed at some point where forgiveness is not appropriate. It's not. We're not talking. I'm very glad you asked that question, Sharon, because we're not talking about every single human situation. Somebody. We're not. In other traditions, when you read about when there were, this happened. It came up in the Democratic campaign that when the shooter murdered 9 people in church. I don't remember where that was, but somewhere in the South. And the first thing that people did, the victims who lost family, they forgave the shooter. I'm not sure I'm so forgiving, but the idea you forgive no matter what it is, you immediately forgive, and that shows your worth as a human being. I don't think we need to be so ready to forgive those kinds of intrusions that are so terrible.
Good, I feel better.
But we're talking
Judaism
about
prevails.
our tradition is more talking about the everyday, not the horrific. Because I think
that point, but we don't have to forget. We don't want to for the everyday things. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, do that was the big question. How we deal with after the Holocaust with Germany. That was a big, in terms of the Israel accepting reparations, where there was this huge fight between Begin and Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion never reconciled accepting reparations. Ben Gurion said Israel needs the money, and now there are good relations. Germany has been pretty good to Israel, good relationship, but there's still people who are resentful that there was ever any kind of reconciliation, which may be moving forward, but it's not certainly not forgetting And, it's not necessarily forgiveness, certainly not forgiveness of the perpetrators, but maybe saying that we're not going to hold the generations, the next generations, culpable for what their parents and grandparents did. But it's very tough. These are very tough questions. It's a much more. So I'm glad you asked the question, but I want to say this is more limited. This is more limited to the everyday, the kinds of things that we hurt people that are, that are part of, that are normal in life, but that are painful and that are hurtful. And how do we, how do we deal with that? So let me see, I'll have one or two more questions, and then nobody in the chat, no questions. Okay, so we may, well, we're at, our hour is up anyhow. So feel free to email me questions in the coming days. As we get closer to the Yontif, it may take me a bit longer to answer the email, but I will answer it at some point. And I will ask your forgiveness. We're talking about for any slights that I've committed in the past. I'm sure there are many of those. It's delightful to spend an hour with all of you, and wish you all well, and stay strong and stay safe and stay good. And we will see you in some form or another in the coming weeks. And some of you will see us and we won't see you if you're watching us on the live stream. I would just say, by the way, as a parenthetical remark that may affect some of you, the live stream is supposed to be accessible for those who don't want to even touch their computer. If you left it on before Shabbat and turned off screensaver, which is not the computer to say you shouldn't do that, but if you want nothing's going to happen in 24 or 48 hours. The problem is it's not allowing that to happen yet, and it requires a reset, like a refresh of the screen, which then defeats the whole purpose. We're working on correcting that. So at the moment, you do have to at some point do some, hands-on work if you're going to be accessing the live stream. That hopefully will change. There are a few other things that we, we've noticed that we're going to be tweaking. That's the point of starting it, a few weeks before Rosh Hashanah. So we want it to really be working great at that point. We're also talking about a lot of, you'll be hearing about this soon, a lot of great opportunities in terms of there'll be options. We're trying to come up with a few outdoor options for people that don't want to come into shul, but want to do certain things outdoors. We're looking at investigating certain things right now, and hopefully within the next few days, we'll have answers for you on those questions. This is unfolding. We're all kind of new at this. So the world is new at this. So, but I think we'll still have some kind of meaningful connectedness for the Yomim Noraim and the ensuing weeks, even though it's going to be a year to remember, to talk to the next generations about. We were there when it was the year 2020, 5780, and boy, that was an interesting year. Let's hope it's only 1 year and it doesn't extend too far beyond that. So to all, Lila Tov, have a good night, good evening, and I look forward to reconnecting with you soon. So next week, I think it might be changing. I think next week might be Michael. And Marshall is going to do next week. I think it's supposed to be Michael. I think they flipped it, but read our communications and you'll find out. As the whole clergy team takes 1 week in these 4 weeks. You've done one now, and there are 3 more to go. Okay, so be well, everybody. Stay safe. Stay happy.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye,
Rabbi.
everyone. Be well.
Thank you very
Be well
much.
too. Be safe.
Shalom Uvracha, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.